Hello, this is Dr. Shajir Usmani. I am a graduate of Dow University of Health Sciences, and I will be presenting data extraction. So up till now, I think you've gone through the presentations that cover the basics of systematic review, literature search, selecting a topic, and all that. And once you're done with the literature search and you're done finalizing the eligible studies for data extraction, this is the next step, right? So when we find our eligible studies, we of course summarize them, we write them down, we list them down in an Excel sheet, right? So in an Excel sheet, you can use either Microsoft Excel offline, or more commonly we use the online version, the Google Sheet option, which is more helpful because it allows you to collaborate between different people, and different people can use the same sheet at once and just extract the data and summarize everything without the need of finalizing it once and then sharing it again. And that is just an unnecessary hassle, right? So we use the online Google Sheet option, where we first list down all the eligible studies, right? We write a heading of study name, study ID, links, a study type, and all that, the basics of all studies, and we list them all down, right? So once we're done with that, once we're done including all the eligible studies, we move on to data extraction, right? So what is data extraction? So data extraction is identifying eligible studies and obtaining the relevant information about those studies in terms of the characteristics of each study, its population, and outcomes that you want to analyze, that you want to work on for your systematic review or even meta-analysis, right? So meta-analysis includes a systematic review because you are including the studies under a PRISMA guideline, under an inclusion and exclusion criteria, which means that they're not randomly selected. They have been selected after a thorough search, after a thorough analysis of all the studies that you have, and then you've included the eligible studies under pre-established eligibility criteria, right? So that is why a systematic review is part of the meta-analysis, because you use those included studies, those eligible studies, for the analysis of the outcomes that you want, right? So this is what data extraction is. You're extracting the relevant data out of all the included studies, and you're summarizing it all in a sheet in a way that is understandable, in a way that is simple, clear, and in a way that allows the person doing the analysis to analyze effectively without being confused. There are three steps to data extraction. The first step is the collection of all data from the included studies in a structured Excel sheet, which we've been talking about. The second step is that the extraction is usually done by 2 to 3 independent reviewers, right? This means that what commonly happens is that only one person is responsible for a certain amount of studies that are being extracted. And we often make this mistake of not reviewing that extraction, and we just move forward with it, right? So that is a wrong practice. So what should happen is that 2 to 3 independent reviewers who are extracting the data should work independently without any influence to extract data into identical sheets without, of course, being able to see the other person's sheet, so that we have maximum transparency, so that we can ensure that there's no copying and there's no external influence involved. This ensures that the data extracted is more reliable, right? So this is what the second step is. And the second last step is that then the sheet is organized and it is classified into study inpatient characteristics, demographics, and the outcomes that you eventually want to work on. Moving forward, this is a sample Google Sheet. This is just to give you a rough idea of how a sheet looks like. And of course, everyone has a different way of presenting the data that they extract, and you won't find a standardized sheet anywhere, right? But of course, there are people who prefer a certain way of presenting the data, and what I do is that I reserve the first 3 rows of the sheet for headings, right? So the first row will only have demographics and characteristics, and then outcomes written, right? So basically, you're categorizing a set of data into either patient characteristics and demographics or outcomes, right? And then the next row, the second row, will have all the individual headings, like, for example, mean age, for example, study link, study ID, country, mean age, a number of patients, and all those basic data sets that you want in demographics and characteristics. And then, of course, under outcomes, you will include headings like, for example, if you're talking about hernias, we talk about complications, recurrence, seroma formation, operative time, and that is just an example. And then the third row will have subheadings of each individual data set that you want to analyze. So for example, if we're doing a meta-analysis comparing two techniques in hernia repair, then we will of course have two patient groups, either representing two different surgical repair techniques, or maybe one control and one surgical repair technique. So we will have to make separate subheadings under each data set that we have. For example, if we have mean age, then mean age should have two subheadings of each group that you're willing to extract data for, right? So that is how I utilize the first three rows just for headings, and then I start extracting the data. So how do you finalize the headings that you want to include? Okay, so what I do is that I go through a study, which is a strong study, does not does has minimum issues, has maximum quality. I go through it and I see all the patient characteristics, demographics involved, and all the outcomes that they've analyzed, right? And then I make a sheet using those very outcomes and characteristics. So I have a rough sample sheet, and of course I will miss a few things, but I can cover that up as I go forward with the rest of the studies, right? So that is how you start making a sheet, and as time moves on and as you're extracting data from multiple studies, you are building on the sheet, you're building on the work that you've done by adding more headings that you find relevant, that you think will be important for the study, for the analysis, or just for the systematic review in general, right? So yeah, that is how you extract data. Moving forward, there are certain things that you have to look out for in data extraction, and there are duplication, organization, and documentation, which I will go one by one. So first is duplication. So what is duplication? This is something that I've talked about before as well. So instead of having one reviewer extracting data from a certain study, we have 2 to 3 independent reviewers who extract data from those studies in independent, identical extraction sheets, right? So that is how we duplicate the data and we ensure transparency and we ensure reliability of the data that is being extracted. Moving forward, the second one is organization. So of course, for the person who is doing the analysis, it's very important that you present the data in a way that is organized and clear. If you don't do that, then that person will be extremely confused before doing the analysis, because first they will have to figure out what is written, right? And they often have to spend a lot of time in organizing the data, in standardizing the data, and that is a huge nuisance, right? So you don't want that. So it's the responsibility of the people who are extracting the data to organize it well. So how do you do that? You plan beforehand. So before you start extracting, you have a meeting. All the reviewers sit down together and discuss a way forward, discuss a plan, that this is how we will do it, and this is how we will counter any discrepancy, this is how we will counter any issues. They should have contingency plans, and they should have backups for all sort of problems that they will face. And that of course comes with the experience that certain researchers have in data extraction, right? So it's important to have at least one experienced researcher who knows how to extract data, because without having them, you're increasing the chances of error, you're increasing the chances of ambiguity, you're increasing the chances of not having reliable data, right? So you have a clear plan, you decide on it, and then you move forward and use standardized identical sheets for data extraction, right? And the last is documentation. This covers accurate reporting and transparency, and just ensuring that if all the data sets that you've extracted information for are documented well, they're standardized, making it easier for the person doing the analysis to go through it, and of course finalizing the outcomes for analysis. And even if you do not have analysis, if you're just doing a plain systematic review, it makes it easier for the people who write the article to interpret the data and include it in the writing and talk about it in the writing. These are some of the common problems that people face in data extraction. The first is disagreement between reviewers when extracting data. And this is very common, right? Certain people might disagree between certain approaches towards extracting data, or maybe what a certain data set means, or how the way the data is represented is interpreted, right? So in that sort of situation, it's important to have a third reviewer resolve that disagreement, right? And the third reviewer should be someone who is experienced, like I said, someone who has experience in data extraction and can help you out thoroughly. The second issue that people face is including estimates and alternative data. So this means that often people misinterpret the data, or maybe they round it off, or maybe they represent it in a way that is not accurate, right? So in this case, it's important to extract the data as it is, as accurately as possible, and then discussing it with other reviewers and the person doing the analysis so that you can reach a conclusive outcome in whether that data set is able to be analyzed or not, right? You can work on that later, work on the eligibility of that data set later, but for now it's important to extract the information as it is, as accurately as possible, including all the relevant data that you have for that particular heading. So the next problem that you usually face is risk of human error, inconsistency, and subjectivity. So human error, of course, is very natural. It's very common. It happens. It's not really something that you can avoid. But how to prevent it from being solidified is that you are thorough with your extraction and that you're revising the work that you've done thoroughly so that you can minimize the risk of error. And inconsistencies and subjectivity are, of course, resolved with having 2 to 3 independent reviewers extracting the data. And these are some of the things that we avoid by using multiple reviewers for data extraction. The next is ambiguous or incomplete data. Certain studies do not have reliable data sets, they don't have complete data sets, or they may be ambiguous, meaning that they're not easily understood, they're represented in a way that is not commonly studied, commonly read about, commonly interpreted. So in that case, it's important to firstly go through the text to understand what that data set is about. And if you cannot find anything related to that, then of course it's important to discuss it with an experienced researcher who is part of your project, or someone who is generally aware about these sorts of issues and resolving the issue after discussion with them. Of course, the first step is to involve your fellow independent reviewers in this discussion and reaching a conclusion regarding that particular data set. And the last is extracting the right amount of data. So it's very difficult to come to a conclusion regarding how much data you want to extract, right? When you're starting data extraction, you're basically just trying to understand what the data sets are, and you're extracting as much information as possible. But when you near the end of data extraction, you start to realize that certain outcomes, certain headings that you've extracted information for will not be eligible for data extraction, will not be eligible for the study, because either they haven't been reported by multiple studies, they've been reported way too less, or they're not consistently reported, or they're reported in a way that can be interpreted differently. For example, they're using different units, different studies are using different units to represent that data set, or a different way of presenting that data set. So in the latter case, in the last case, you can try to standardize the data set and align it with the data that you've extracted from the other studies. But if that's not possible, often we tend to exclude that data, that heading, from our final manuscript writing and analysis, right? So these are some things that you look out for when you extract data. Talking about the source, you talk about the study ID, report ID, review author ID, just basic things about every study that you find eligible. And the citation, meaning that the reference and the contact details of the authors involved if available, right? And the next thing is eligibility. Of course, this is reaffirmed at this point because when you're doing literature search, you're also sort of finalizing studies that are eligible for your analysis, for your systematic review. And at this step, when you're extracting the data, you're reassuring, you're finalizing the eligibility, and then excluding certain studies as per the eligibility criteria that you set. So it's important to also note down the reason for that exclusion, because you will have to talk about it in your manuscript, right? Then we have methods in which we commonly talk about the study design, the study duration, sequence generation, allocation, sequence concealment, blinding, how the study was blinded, and other concerns about bias, because certain studies may have a high risk of bias, certain studies may have a low risk of bias. So that is why we do quality assessment, right? So you talk about this in the methods as well, that how you're doing quality assessment, which method is being used, and yeah, that's what comes under methods. And then you talk about your participants, the basic characteristics and demographics of your participants. What are you trying to report, right? And then we have outcomes. Of course, this is the main part for any systematic review, especially a meta-analysis, because this is the part that you will eventually analyze, right? So for every outcome, you include the outcome definition. Now, I want to emphasize on this because when we're doing a meta-analysis, certain outcomes might be defined in different ways, right? And they may be named in different ways. So it's easier for the extractors to get confused as to how to represent that data, what heading to include it under. So that's why it's important to first read up on the topic that you're covering, right? And how do you do that? When you're doing literature search, you're also reading up on the topic and the main outcomes that you will extract. And when you're extracting data from a particular study, go through the full text. Just don't go through the data sets, the tables. Go through the full text of the article, because the article will talk about the definition of those outcomes, how they've defined an outcome, and then maybe you will realize, oh, this is an outcome that I've already extracted from other studies, but it was named differently, it was defined differently, but it's the same outcome, right? Then unit of measurement. Some studies might use different units of measurement. So what you do is first you extract the data and then you try to standardize it using calculators, using converters, and you can take help from the person who is doing the analysis in doing that. And of course, then for scales, we have upper and lower limits. Certain studies might use different scales for the same outcome. So you can include all the scales that are being used in studies, and then maybe if you have a sufficient amount of data regarding that scale being extracted from at least 2 to 3 studies, maybe you can think about including it in the analysis, right? And then we have results. In results, we first talk about the number of participants that we have allocated to each intervention group. If you're not talking about any intervention group, then you just talk about the participants generally. And then we come to the outcomes of interest. We include the sample size. Missing participants is important because, for example, if we talk about surgery, certain patients might be lost to follow-up, or even in medicine, for example, in patients with chronic illnesses like chronic kidney disease or heart disease, certain patients might be lost to follow-up after a certain period of time. So when we're reporting a certain data, when those studies are reporting certain data, they might have missing participants in certain outcomes, right? Because those outcomes are being measured after a certain point in time. Maybe they're measuring an improvement in pain, or for example quality of life, right? So that happens after certain intervals that are pre-established, right? So some patients might be lost to that follow-up, and that is why the studies report that, and then they decrease those lost patients from the total number of patients in the data set. So it's very important to include that, to take that into account before your analysis, because it changes the outcome of the analysis, and of course it has a certain impact as well. And then you summarize the data for each intervention group. There's dichotomous, whether they're using mean, standard deviation, or maybe they're using median. Whatever they're using, you summarize the data for each intervention on the Google Sheet that we've talked about, right? So, of course, data extraction is not easy. For a beginner, it can get very technical and very hard to go through. But with time, it gets easier because you start to understand how to formulate the sheet, how to organize it, how to document data better, and what to extract data for, what to leave out, and of course it all comes with experience. So I recommend consistency. I recommend thoroughness when you do data extraction. Take help. Feel free to take help from your teammates, from the seniors that are part of your project, or even if you know someone who is generally experienced and they're generally helpful, they're easier to reach out to. Do that. Do not be shy, do not be hesitant in reaching out to experienced researchers, because it takes time, it takes effort, and it sometimes we all need help regarding certain tasks in research, right? It's not easy. So anyway, that is all for data extraction, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.